you like to be known as a great manager? This is the Ukwanda podcast, where we focus on people management in Africa. In this episode, we interview Jonathan Cook. He is the co-founder and chairman of the African Management Initiative, which offers scalable approaches to developing African managers and entrepreneurs across the continent. He is a past director and is currently part-time faculty member of the Gordon Institute of Business Science. And he is also chairman and chief consultant of Thornhill Associates that provide online 360-degree feedback questionnaires to companies. After qualifying as a counselling psychologist, he spent 10 years with the National Institute for Personnel Research in Johannesburg, followed by 15 years at the Wits Business School, where he founded the Management Development Unit and was academic director. He is a past chairman of the Association of African Business Schools and serves on the boards of community organisations Tomorrow Trust and Biz School. Enjoy. A few short questions just for people to get to know you first. If you could be anyone in history, who would you choose and why?
Anyone in history? Oh my goodness of me. I'm torn between sort of one of the great statesmen who has changed the face of history as sort of Alexander the Great. Not that I would ever have been able to achieve his kind of expansion, but probably more a great teacher.
Okay.
So a kind of Socrates type character who asked lots of profound questions and helped people change their minds.
I see, okay. And so the teaching aspect, is that what sort of interests you?
I think so, yes.
Okay, cool, that's interesting. If you had to choose another profession or major, what would it be and why?
Well, I started off in psychology, and so I would probably, if I hadn't gone into management education, I probably would have stayed in psychology, but very likely psychology teaching, in fact, an academic career. I enjoy research, and I would have been very interested to find out more about what makes us tick.
Okay.
And there's such interesting things happening, in fact, in the world of psychology at the moment, because it's a very young science, and it would be nice to be part of that thinking.
Okay. Yeah. What, if I may ask, made you change over into management training?
It was fortuitous, as so often happens. I was at the NIPR, the National Institute of Personnel Research at the time, and one of my part-time staff, Mandla Adanisi, was teaching at the Wits Business School. And one day he said, "Why don't you come and teach at the business school?" And I thought, well, I've been doing this NIPR stuff for 10 years. It's getting a bit boring. The organisation wasn't going anywhere, so let me give it a try. And I guess it was the thought of doing something a bit varied, and the teaching side. So I gave it a try. I hadn't realised how little I knew. My knowledge was very specialised. I think I was reasonably well known in the counselling psychology field, but not in human resource management. So I learned a lot from my students in the first year or two.
Okay. And so were you happy with your choice going into and sticking there?
Yes, not initially. I almost left because I turned out to be a very poor teacher. The first class complained to the dean about me. I was so boring. So I really had to work at that. I had to work very hard at becoming more interesting. So that was a scary discovery, but I thought, no, let me see this through.
Yeah.
And in retrospect, it was a very good choice because I've learned so much, and it exposed me to a world of business and leadership that I might not otherwise have gained into.
Okay. I must say, I was in one of your recent classes, and I was very impressed by the way that you facilitated very difficult conversations. If I can quickly go into that line, where did you learn your facilitation skills, and if there was one or two practical tips that you can give people?
That's an interesting question. I've often thought about it because when you do something where you don't always know where it comes from. One source definitely is my training as a psychologist. So I trained in Rogerian type non-directive counselling. So I learned to listen there, listen closely, and to reflect. And that's been very, very helpful. I think that feeds into the way I was brought up, which is to be highly respectful of people. So I really do want to find out where people are and what they're thinking. Then I had to learn a whole lot of craft around classroom management and designing of process so that people have a variety of activities and areas of thinking. I designed a course for the Association of African Business Schools based on Harvard Business School case teaching, and that was also very helpful to understand what the Harvard Business School professors, how they learn about case teaching, what they mean by case teaching. And it's a whole discipline in itself, which is very, very fascinating. I find it so. So those are some of the combinations. And if you ask about a practical tip, I would say it is around really genuinely wanting to hear and understand what the group is saying, and to bring that knowledge to the understanding of the rest of the group. So you are helping to interpret each person into the minds of the rest of the group. And you do that through a kind of questioning, an open-ended questioning, where the questions are things you actually want to know. Now, you get some teaching styles where the teacher raises a question that you can answer with information. I don't ask those kind of questions, not at graduate level anyway, because what we're aiming for in graduate learning is not so much information as insight. So if I ask a question, something that I really want to know about this person's opinion, and that makes me curious, then I think that reflects in the class as a whole.
I see. So it gets you in a right frame of mind, actually, to be able to take it further. Putting myself in your shoes, you were asking questions around land reclamation and gender equality and stuff like that. Now, I would be frightened, so frightened to actually raise those topics in a very diverse group of people. What's your mindset there? Maybe you can talk about, I'm sure there must have been some interesting failures as well in the past in these kinds of discussions.
Yeah, that's also a good question, Hofner. I suppose partly having done it for many, many years, I've gained confidence that I know I can handle it, because it can be scary. My failures have tended to be, I've never thought this before, but I think when I haven't gone far enough rather than when I've sort of tried to be controversial or opened the conversation. My failures have been more towards the sort of so what side than the more profound side. There have been times when the class in this kind of conversation has got quite emotional. But again, my psychology training has given me confidence that I can handle it. I can bring the temperature down again. And I am doing it with deep respect for people, so I'm not going to expose them to something that's going to be damaging to them. And so I guess it's almost like group therapy. I'm continually monitoring the emotional temperature in the class, making sure it's high enough to stimulate learning, but not so high that people are damaged in the process. And I don't think, I certainly hope there's not been damage in the discussions. But that degree of emotional involvement generates learning, because, as I say, it's not information that you're aiming for so much as insight. And in the program that you were in, particularly self-insight, as we realize how limited our own personal perspectives are, and how biased our perceptions are. Without exception, we're all subject to the biases that we've grown up with and been exposed to through society.
How well do you think managers in general rate on this ability of being able to facilitate a discussion instead of just making quick decisions?
On the whole, I would rate them very low. There are some wonderful exceptions, and they tend to do well. It's interesting that if you look at people who do well, who rise up to the top of organizations, not always, but very often, they are highly emotionally intelligent. And they can sense what's going on, and they can use that emotional information to manage group processes very effectively, to motivate people, to bring them together, etc. Obviously, there are exceptions to that. But on the whole, it's not something we are taught. We in fact learn to be competitive, we learn to be damaging in many respects. And the models that people have to follow when it comes to leadership often are quite damaging models too. So one hardly blame us for growing up that way. So it is a skill that I feel quite strongly about. I think it's something we should be teaching more. It's very difficult to learn, actually, particularly if you try and learn it as a skill. I think if one learns it as a life philosophy, a respect for human dignity, that's more than half the battle won already.
Okay. So it's not just knowledge, it's also the way you view things, your worldview, your mindset.
Exactly.
Okay. What would you say to someone who is convinced that this is something, it's either inborn rather than a skill? I mean, someone could very easily come back and say, that's just not me, that's not my personality. What would you say to that person?
we can always learn. I think it's true that there is a genetic element to just about every human quality. And so the ability to listen, the ability to facilitate, all these useful skills, I'm sure people do vary on the normal curve on those abilities, as with any ability. But if you take physical ability, I'm never going to be a star football player, but I can learn to kick a ball better than I do now. And that takes training, practice, determination. And with training, practice and determination, you can learn to listen better, and you can train your mind.
Okay. So with that, if you need determination, if it's a difficult skill to learn, you need determination to do it. What would your approach be to get this on someone's priority list? I mean, the stuff that you do is the stuff that's most important to you. So how do you raise the importance of this issue on a manager's priority list so that they actually end up following through?
I think experience is a great teacher. So if you can help people to reflect on the experiences that they're going through at work, with some well-directed questions, like, what is it that most frustrates you at work? Where do you waste the most time? What is the biggest threat to your company's success? Very often, the answer to all of those are people matters. Because to run a good business, you need market conditions, all the rest of it, but you need a good team, and you need the team to work together, and you need the silos to be overcome, and you need people to be thinking creatively and motivated. All these things. So these are right at the top of most CEOs' lists. And so you just have to ask people to stop and think, if that is the case, if that's such a key strategic priority for you as well as operational, then your biggest task is people. And of course, because we are trained in our profession to become an engineer, accountant, or whatever it might be, and we spend 12 years of schooling, another 3 or 4, 7 years of post-school education in our discipline, then we work as professionals, our whole focus is on technical competence rather than people competence. And so it's difficult to let go of that and realize that people are not the interruption to my job, which is this technical thing, that as a manager, people are my job. And that's one of the big mindset changes that has to happen in business leadership, is to realize that people are my job. And if that's the case, I've spent so many dozens of years learning my technical proficiency, I better start learning my human proficiency, because that's what my job is now.
I remember reading, I think Graham Sharan talks about that first bend in the leadership pipeline, that being the most difficult is that mindset shift that you're talking about there. How do you coach a leader to make that shift? What are the main, I guess we've been talking about this up to now anyway, but if a manager were to listen to this episode, what do they need to look for in themselves to be able to make that mind shift?
I think that's well put. Self-knowledge is a very important condition for becoming effective in that area. So what do they need to look at in themselves? For shorthand of ourselves as having sort of 3 layers of knowledge. The outer layer, which is the one that matters in the workplace in a practical way, is the layer of behavior. And that's what 360s measure. And it is critically important to know how you are experienced by other people and what consequences your behaviors have on other people. We are, as a species, notoriously poor at knowing ourselves. That's well researched. Research also shows that people who know themselves better, in the sense that their self-assessment correlates better with how other people see them, are rated as better managers. So knowing what you're doing and what the impact of that is on other people is really important. And that's where a 360-degree feedback questionnaire is so helpful, because you get other people's anonymous and therefore hopefully honest description of how you come across to them. Now that's the one layer, and that's critical for work effectiveness. How you get to manage your behavior depends on the other 2 layers. At the center, the inner layer, is who we are. Whether it's by nature or by nurture, we've grown up with certain characteristics. Those are either impossible or very difficult to change, so it's probably better to accept those, to celebrate those. Then in between those, the inner and the outer layer, is a layer of habits, particularly thought habits. To know that the inner layer you can get to know by psychometric instruments, personality and intelligence tests and so on, and by helpful professional feedback on that. That middle layer of habits, which are, as I said, particularly thought habits, that's quite difficult to access actually, because there aren't instruments that tell you what your thoughts are. You've got to think about, what are my assumptions? What patterns of thinking do I go through when I'm in a situation? And as you begin to identify those patterns of thinking which underlie the behavior, then you can begin to work on them and gradually replace those that are not helpful with those that are helpful. A great insight I gained from systems family therapy is a respect for us as human beings and why we do what we do. There's a good reason for all of our behavior, however bizarre it might be. And if we can understand the assumptions that are underpinning whatever we're doing that we want to change, then it's easier to change the behavior once we've changed the assumptions to a more accurate assumption about ourselves and about the world. Okay. So that's a bit kind of theoretical, but I think a big task of leadership and management development is understanding the core of myself by good measurement, understanding the behavior by 360 and other forms of feedback, and then doing the reflection that says, so what are my assumptions that are getting in the way and are helping me, and let me build the latter and change the former.
So just in listening to your answer, one of the assumptions that I'm picking up from you is that everyone has good reasons for why they do what they do.
Yeah.
As opposed to what I think people so naturally fall into this mindset of they should be doing this or they should be doing that. Why aren't they? There's something wrong with the person. What, in your opinion, if you could give a few other examples of underpinning thoughts like this one, everyone's got a good reason for what they do, would you say could be useful to adopt?
Okay, some of the unhelpful assumptions are no longer helpful. They were valid, but they become deeply ingrained habits of thinking, and I've still got them. So there might be childhood ways of getting my own way, for example, and to use those in an adult business world is counterproductive. So that's the kind of thing you'd want to change. Example of a positive assumption would be many of the things that positive psychology give us today. So a self-image, that I have value to offer. Mm-hmm. The fundamental one is I'm okay just because I exist. I'm a human being. Mm. In theological terms, that's grace. You're accepted just because you are who you are. Mm. There's a sense in which Ubuntu, I suppose, describes not quite the same thing, but has a similar assumption behind it, is that humanity makes you worthwhile. Mm. Then arising out of that, I've got qualities that are valuable. And often our qualities can be seen helpfully or unhelpfully. So our strengths and weaknesses are often two sides of the same coin. So I'm by nature quite a shy person, and that can be seen as a barrier, but it can also be seen as a gift of sensitivity, awareness, that I can listen well. Mm. Anger sounds like a negative thing, but it represents passion, determination to get things right. And when you start seeing your qualities in positive terms like that, then you can channel them. So how can I use my energy, which is expressed in anger, how can I use it in ways that are more productive? If I'm a cold person, I'm seen to be aloof, that's a problem in terms of relationships. But it also indicates probably a respect for cognition, for thinking, for a respect for reason, and that's a hugely important contribution. Okay. Then I don't have to change that. I might be able to add some qualities of interpersonal effectiveness to it, so that my reason is more readily available to the rest of the group. But let me not stop thinking, because that's a gift, and each of us brings gifts to the group. That's not to say that all we do is right. Clearly, there's lots we do which is wrong, ethically wrong, and that needs to be managed. That needs to be controlled. We need laws, and people need to be disciplined, and all the rest of it. But when we discipline people for behavior, that should never undermine the gifts they bring as human beings.
Okay, so talk to me a little bit about the relationship between a positive-minded leader, and you're trying to create a certain culture around that, And on the other side, you've got an environment that allows or punishes certain kinds of behavior, and both working together to kind of create a virtuous system. What is the role of the environment, and what are some pointers in designing a system that reinforces the kind of behaviors that you would like to see in your team or in your organization?
I mean, you've asked a question which has been asked and thought about for millennia, thousands and thousands of years. The playoff between sort of controls and affirmation. The philosophers dealt with it. Theologians have dealt with it. Law and grace. Psychologists have dealt with it. Management, the Ohio studies have identified the two dimensions in leadership research of structure and consideration. Structure and consideration, which in situational leadership came up as task and people. So the demand, if you like, and the acceptance. And in managing an organization to try and shape behavior in the way you want it to go, you have to not so much compromise between these two as try to optimize them. So there need to be rules and regulations, and there needs to be enforcement. You need to have auditors, and you need to have consequences. If that's all you have a very oppressive situation in which people won't express initiative. So alongside that, you've got to have deep respect. I keep coming back to that. Deep respect and opportunity to express initiative and celebration of success, all those things. So leadership is about, I think leadership is a lot about managing those two poles. How can I really energize the organization through enthusiasm, through close attention to people's ideas, celebrating their successes, affirming their gifts, teaching them to respect each other and to listen to each other, modeling that all the time. So all the emotionally intelligent aspects. And when we look at the interpersonal and personal side of 360 feedback in Thornhill Associates, we refer to that as a dimension of energy. That's when you're energizing people and energizing yourself. And then alongside, how can I set up processes that are immutable almost, the sort of law of the Medes and Persians, this is a wall I cannot break through. If I want to do anything unethical, it's going to catch me. Okay. So the rules must be there, and the enforcement must be there, and the consequences must be obvious and evident to everyone. I'm not against shaming people who've been fired for dishonesty by naming the problem and the person, because that's the way their colleagues learn. So that's quite harsh, but it's done within a culture of real understanding and acceptance and forgiveness, where there's genuine attempt to do better. We all do things we don't want to do, and we all don't do the things we do want to do. So we need help to do what is right. Okay. There are a few people in the world who are going to do wrong whatever we do, and there are a few people in the world who will do right whatever happens, and there are a large mass in the middle who will be persuaded. And you'll be persuaded by the positive energy and by the consequences. I will be caught if I don't do it right.
Thank you for listening to the first part of our interview with Jonathan Cook. In the next installment, Jonathan talks about performance management, learning organizations, feedback, and behavior change. We would love to open the floor to you. If you would like to share some of your insights, please email me at hofmeyr@jvrafrica.co.za. That's HOFMEYR@jvrafrica.co.za.